into the open society.
Well, are you saying that a state the size of Bermuda can make intelligent exercises of charitable redistribution?
Whether it would be intelligent, could be principled and could pursue clear aims. I don't know what the population of Bermuda is. It probably is already too big for that purpose. But a state consisting of 10 or 20,000 people could probably do it. There you still have visible, conceivable needs of known people whom you can ascertain. But the whole advance of society is that we have created an order in something very much bigger than any single mind can conceive, can survey. And we have created some sort of order and created conditions and productivity by applying to their individual action universal rules and then letting them play what I call this game, which is partly a game of skill and partly a game of chance, and that the outcome of this game is are the rewards, the prizes, which tell people what they ought to do, both in their own and in the general interest. Prizes, after all, tell people what they ought to do in order to make the greatest contribution to the social product.
Well, Mr. Rhodes, let me ask you this. Is it your notion that a society ought not to undertake redistribution because it cannot define justice, or because it has no legitimate authority to engage in the act of redistribution?
Both, as a matter of fact, but before I answer, please don't leave the impression in anyone's mind, Bill, that half of our money at Hillsdale comes from the federal government, because as you already are perfectly aware, none of our money comes from the federal government or the state government.
You disdain it.
In any event, as to the question of justice, it occurs to me that such a thing as social justice becomes almost a contradiction in terms, because if you examine the philosophic roots that produced the modern egalitarian ideal, those roots contain all sorts of departures from the idea that it is possible to establish a difference between right and wrong. They deny the operation of a moral framework and ultimately come to the utilitarian goal that all ideas and all values are to be considered essentially on their own merits. And the same people who have said that and are busy then undercutting the more traditional values in Western civilization are the same people who then go on and prate about social justice as though somehow the assignment of numbers, of quantification, will tell us something about justice, and in fact it will not. So I don't think that you can define social justice. You can define social injustice. You can produce a socially unjust situation, but to do so, what you've really done is undercut individual morality and the opportunity to make those choices that have genuine moral content.
But why is it inconsistent for a logical positivist to say, on the one hand, I decline to accept as just that which the majority ordains, but I agree to back that which it does because this is an attempt, a conscious attempt at the workings of justice by people who are as instructed as any society can hope to be at a given moment?
Well, I don't think that this definition of social justice carries that kind of validity. When people begin to talk about justice or a certain kind of definition of right and wrong, it's always a fair question to ask the source of their ideas. And that same man who is so determined to provide this egalitarian way of the future, and that plan for how other people should conduct their affairs, has denied the idea that there can be a source. And for him simply to say that the majority constitutes that source, or that he has a degree of enlightenment denied the rest of us, is arrogance. That's not proof.
Well, let me ask you a concrete example, and perhaps you and Dr. Hayek can address yourself to it. Suppose you have a state in which extreme conditions exist. In one area of the state, $50 a year is spent towards the education of a child. in the other end of the state, $1,000 per year is spent towards the education of the child. Is the concept of justice invocable in the society that says we must do what we can to diminish that antipodes? We must pay more for the education of the child down in the southern region, even if it means diminishing the grant to the child in the upper region. Is this, as thus far described, a rough attempt at, quote, justice?
No, because justice, after all, still is, as we heard earlier, an essentially individual idea. That morality is the difference between right and wrong in concrete, specific decisions and transactions between and among individuals. When this is elevated to a social plane, it ceases to have any particular recognizable content as justice.
But is that terminologically subjective? If an individual decides to give succor to a hungry person, why is that different from 10 individuals giving succor to 10 hungry people?
Or privately and individually?
No, even if they use the instrumentality of the tribe.
Because at that point I become the sucker for them, because it's my taxes that accompany theirs. It's fine for you to decide to be charitable. It is not fine for you to be charitable with my resources as opposed to yours. In fact, there's no charity connected with them.
Well, this really depends on the rules of society, doesn't it?
Well, it raises the question, what is a society?
I'm acquainted with your essay that says that no such thing exists.
I mean, is the fact that the people of Oklahoma and the people of New York find it convenient to have a common system of law and of rules, a justification that the people of Oklahoma can demand that the people of New York, out of their pocket, assist the people of Oklahoma? I mean, it's a question which, once you ask it, you will agree there's nothing like a moral agreement which creates such a right. It's merely the fact, well, where there is the power, and once we have a common state, there is the power, it is accepted as legitimate that this power takes out of the pockets of the rich and out of the... now, does it mean that if we have a world government, we can tax the Americans to, all Americans, to 80% of their incomes in order to maintain the Chinese? I mean, that's the same principle applied. That once you have an international government, there would be the international power. You would have to claim that it is perfectly legitimate if that international government decides to tax all Americans to 80% of their income, hand it over to the Chinese, and feed the Chinese. Whatever we may think about desirable future rules of morals, there's no doubt that the existing rules of morals do not justify this. And I would maintain that, in fact, when today the wealthy parts of the United States are heavily taxed in favor of the poorer parts, this is not the result of any moral agreement of the majority of the American people, but solely the effect that whatever party is in power needs the woods of Oklahoma and pays for the woods of Oklahoma at the cost of the people of the wealthier parts, nothing else.
Well, but the motivations of the people who pass those laws are not necessarily the motivations of people who are propelled by demagogic pressure, are they? You're not denying disinterested generosity exercised in the legislature, are you?
It's an entirely different matter. Disinterested generosity determines voluntary action. But to claim that there is a consensus of the American people which authorizes the legislature to bring about a certain redistribution of income is in fact not true. The American people have never asked about the principles that ought to be applied in this. All they are told is that in fact the the Democratic Party, who promises you such and such, will be in power only if it buys the support of the people in Oklahoma. And since you know that you will get from the Democratic Party only what you expect from it, you vote from it, and you take into account the necessity that in order that the Democratic Party gets into power, it has to pay special benefits to the people of Oklahoma. That's what it comes to.
Judged by the results, this idea of disinterested generosity is the one thing we cannot expect from the public sector. Pick your legislature and you'll see a series of special interest groups operating in a variety of ways, contending essentially for power. And I think proving the very point that it's impossible to be generous with other people's resources, even if it were morally possible, which it is not.
Well, it seems to me that Aristotle tackled that problem where there was no question of a democratic base. And he simply talked about doing the right thing. And he was talking about a class of people who exercised
Yes, but he also said that a democracy in a state of more than 10,000 people is impossible.
That's right.
And his numbers were probably high at that.
No. I know. I'm aware of that. But Aristotle was also talking about the obligations of those in power and assuming that the obligations of those in power gave them authority over people other than themselves, and defined, or attempted to, the right thing to do and the wrong thing to do.
How do the lines go? Power into will, will into appetite, and appetite and universal wolf, so doubly seconded with will and power, must make perforce a universal prey and last eat up himself?
You know, a much equally great philosopher, Immanuel Kant, has once said, welfare has no principle. And therefore, we cannot involve welfare of different people because there are no known rules by which we can do it.
When we do this, aren't we making the wrong expectation? If I give you a working example, I was raised in the mountains in Colorado in a very rural community and attended an 8 grades in 1 room rural schoolhouse, a public school, publicly financed. But the people supporting the school were the ranch families living there who simply felt that their youngsters, myself included, had to have an education. So there was a teacher brought in and local taxes collected. But this was the clearest kind of extension of the responsibility of the parent to do something for the education of his own children. And eventually, of course, what happened in Colorado, what happened all over the country occurred. Consolidation, it was called there, came along, and the little local school gave way to the busing of children many miles away to larger schools, presumably at the time because of all the benefits that were going to derive to the children. The benefits in the form of chemistry laboratories and swimming pools and the things simply not available in this little country school. The actuality of that was, of course, while the taxes went up 400 or 500% in intervening years, and the local communities were caused to pay a higher and higher price, that the quality of the education the youngsters were receiving in the larger and larger schools actually became more inferior. The reason being that it was moved further away from the basic responsibility of the individual parent. And with variations, something like that could be said about virtually every aspect of our lives, the responsibilities that we have as individuals, which are presumably exercised and discharged collectively, but in fact never are, and I think never can be.
Well, are you saying that the Bronx High School of Science has an inferior record to the local school in New York?
Of course not, no. There are obvious special cases. It's possible to subsidize the Vienna Opera House, too, but that is not well, I think the exception almost proves the rule.
Well, may I comment on this? You know, I'm by birth an Austrian, and I love the Vienna Opera, but whether it's really justifiable to tax 7 million people in order to give 500,000 the chance to have a first-class opera, I'm very doubtful indeed.
Our examiner today is Mr. Jeff Greenfield. Familiar to viewers of this program, Mr. Greenfield is a graduate of the University of Wisconsin, where he was the editor of the student paper. He's a graduate of the law school at Yale University. He was a speechwriter for Senator Robert Kennedy and for Mayor John Lindsay before belatedly retiring to become a freelance writer.
Also an alumnus of the Bronx High School of Science, I might add.
I know.
My first question is, why are you all wearing the same tie? Is this some cabal, some collectivist plot? Or
I won't talk.
Okay. Then on to more trivial concerns. Mr. Roach, let's start with this concept of social justice.